A man dragged himself through knee-deep snow with one arm useless at his side, blood freezing black against the white before it reached the ground. Somewhere behind him, in the dark beyond the ridge, 3 riders were still searching, their torches swinging like slow orange eyes across the drifts. Ahead of him, a single window glowed amber through the storm, the only warmth for 11 miles. He did not know the woman inside. He did not know that her name was already carved, twice, into the frozen ground behind her house. He only knew he could not stop moving. Months later, the whole of Larkspur Crossing would remember the morning he stepped between her and 6 armed men in the middle of the street, his coat open, his hand resting easy on a gun everyone in the territory had heard of. "She is not yours to move," he said, quiet enough that the crowd had to lean in to hear it, loud enough that every one of them understood. The men who had spat at her in church not a season before now stood with their hats in their hands, watching a gunslinger choose the Korean widow over all of them. Behind the house, past the frozen well and the leaning fence line, 3 wooden markers stood crooked in the snow, one for each winter she had survived on that claim alone. She had dug 2 of those graves herself, in ground so hard it broke 2 shovels before it broke her resolve. The third, she had not been strong enough to dig alone, and a stranger with a scarred jaw and a stolen horse had done it for her without being asked, without saying a word about why his hands already knew how. This was the 4th winter Iso Bayek had faced that plain alone, and the town of Larkspur Crossing had already decided how her story would end, the same way it decided everything about her, from a distance, without asking. But 4 winters is a long time for a woman with iron in her spine, and it was long enough this time for someone to finally stay. This is the story of the winter she stopped burying people and started building a life instead. Iselbeck stepped off the wagon at the edge of a homestead that was nothing but flattened grass and a half-built soddy. And the first thing she noticed was how the wind never stopped moving, the way the sea never stopped moving back home in Busan. Except here there was no sea, only miles of pale grass bending in every direction, like water with nowhere to go. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to marry a man she knew only from a photograph and 3 letters written in a hand that trembled with either excitement or illness. She had not been able to tell which. Junbek turned out to be both kinder and thinner than his photograph. A man who had spent 2 years alone breaking sod with a borrowed plow and had nothing left to show a bride but a roof, a stove, and an apology. He repeated so often she eventually asked him to stop. He was not what Larkspur Crossing had expected either. The town had watched her wagon roll in with open curiosity that curdled fast into something colder once they understood what she was and was not a servant, not passing through, but a wife, staying. Jun did his best to shield her from it that first season, walking a half step ahead of her at the trading post, answering questions meant to shame her before she had to. He taught her the names of things in English at night by lamplight, wheat and creek and coyote, and she taught him words in return that he butchered so badly she laughed for the first time since the ship. There was a tenderness between them that grew faster than either had expected, built less on romance than on the simple relief of not being alone in a country that made its unfriendliness plain. But the cough that had shadowed his letters had never fully left him, and the plains winter that arrived that first November did not care that he had survived worse. By December, he could not rise from the bed without her arm beneath his shoulders. By January, the fever that the town doctor refused to treat without payment up front had settled so deep in his chest that even the wood she burned through the night could not warm the sound of his breathing. She held his hand through the worst of it and understood, watching the frost climb the inside of the window glass, that she had come 14,000 miles to learn exactly how alone a person could be. Junbek died 2 days before the solstice, in the coldest hour of the coldest night the homestead had yet seen, and Isol was the one who closed his eyes because there was no one else within 4 miles willing to come. The ground was frozen iron hard, too hard for a single grieving woman to break with a borrowed spade, so she built a fire over the patch of earth behind the house and fed it through 2 full days until the soil beneath finally surrendered, blackened and steaming in the cold, soft enough to dig. She dug through blistered palms and did not stop to bandage them until the hole was deep enough to keep the coyotes out. Word reached Larkspur Crossing before the ground had even settled, and what came back was not casseroles or condolence, but a visiting committee of 3 women from the church who arrived to inform her, with the particular gentleness reserved for delivering bad news to someone they had already decided did not matter, that a widow with no children and no English worth mentioning had no real claim to a dead man's land, and that the Christian thing, the practical thing, would be for her to sell quietly and take the next train east before anyone had to make it official. Isol thanked them for their concern in words she had practiced in front of a cracked mirror and told them in the same careful English that she intended to keep the claim, keep the house, and keep her husband's grave on the land he had died breaking. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The women left with their mouths set in thin, disapproving lines and spread through town by supper that the foreign widow at the Bayek claim had refused good counsel and would surely be gone by spring anyway, one way or another. Isol heard the way they said it, one way or another, through the thin walls of the trading post, the one time she dared to go in for salt, and she understood it as the threat it was dressed up to sound like kindness. That night, she sat by June's grave with a blanket around her shoulders, long after the cold had turned her breath to a visible thing in the dark, and she made herself a promise that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the particular stubbornness that had gotten her across an ocean in the first place. She would not be gone by spring. She would not be gone by any spring they could imagine for her. She did not yet know how many more winters that promise would cost her, or who, if anyone, would still be standing beside her when the debt finally came due. What? The first winter without Jun taught Isol things no letter home could have prepared her for. Chief among them, that hunger has a sound, a thin, scraping quiet, that fills a one-room house when the flour sack empties faster than the credit at the trading post, allows it to be refilled. She rationed what little June had left behind, dried beans, a half sack of cornmeal, the seed corn she refused on principle to eat no matter how hollow her stomach became, and she supplemented it with what her mother had taught her in another life, in another country, about which roots held water through a drought, and which bitter greens under snow could be boiled soft enough to eat. The plains did not grow the vegetables of her childhood, but hunger is a great translator, and she found kin in wild onion and lamb's quarter, and the tough little roots the local farmers called Indian turnip and mostly ignored. She kept 3 chickens alive through cold that killed a neighbor's whole coop by feeding them from her own meager stores, because she understood, the way anyone who has survived real scarcity understands, that eggs in February were worth more than pride. The men who came to check on the widow's claim, and they came, circling like men do when they smell a woman alone on land worth having, found her chopping her own wood with a rhythm too practiced to be accidental, and left without saying whatever they had planned to say. She was not, they reported back to whoever had sent them, quite as helpless as expected. Word of that got back to her sideways, through a boy who delivered mail and liked her enough to translate town gossip when no one was listening, and it gave her something she had not expected to feel that winter. A small, sharp satisfaction, warm enough to burn through a few cold nights on its own. She marked the days by carving small lines into the doorframe, the way she had seen prisoners do in a story once, though she was not a prisoner, only a woman keeping count of how long she had managed to still be standing. By the time the lines numbered past 90, she had stopped flinching when riders passed near the house, had stopped waiting for someone to arrive and fix what could not be fixed. She understood by February that no one was coming to save the Beck claim, but the woman who now owned it in every way but the one the law recognized. Spring came late that first year, as if the plains themselves were reluctant to admit that Isolde Bayek had survived the winter they had all quietly bet against. And when it finally arrived, she carried it into Larkspur Crossing on a Sunday, dressed in the one good coat she owned, to sit in the church pew that had been hers and June's since their wedding. The congregation noticed her the way a held breath notices an interruption, a ripple of turned heads and lowered voices. And by the time the second hymn ended, a deacon's wife had leaned across 2 rows to inform her, quietly enough to seem private and loudly enough to be heard by everyone who mattered, that the Bayek pew had been reassigned to a family more recently arrived, a family that, unlike her, had a husband still living to claim it. Isolde stood without argument and moved to the back row, where the widowers and the destitute and the occasional Indian tradesman, permitted through the door on charity, sat in a loose, unclaimed cluster. And she did not cry, not there, not where they could see it and call it proof of what they already believed about her. She cried instead on the ride home, alone on the wagon seat with the reins slack in her hands, letting the horse find its own way back to the claim because her eyes were too full to trust the road. But she went back the next Sunday, and the one after that, not out of any particular faith in the God the deacon's wife claimed to serve so devotedly, but because leaving that seat empty would have been its own kind of surrender. And Isolde Bayek had already decided, somewhere in the frozen dark of December, that surrender was the one thing this country would not get from her. She planted her first crop of sorghum that spring, with seeds she had bartered for, with 3 months of mending other people's clothes, work she took in secret through the boy who delivered her mail, because no one in Larkspur Crossing would hire the widow directly, only her hidden labor, her hidden hands, stitched into shirts that men wore to church without ever knowing whose fingers had saved the collar from fraying. She worked the field until her back screamed and her palms bled fresh through old calluses. And she did not stop, because stopping was the only defeat this land could actually hand her. And she told herself she had already buried the worst thing it could take. She did not yet know how wrong that thought would turn out to be. Hyun Woo Baek arrived at his son's homestead in early summer of the second year, an old man who had spent 11 months and every coin he owned crossing an ocean to reach a country he had never wanted to see, carrying a photograph of a grandson who did not exist, and a hope already fraying that his son had simply been too busy to write. Isolde met him at the rail stop in Larkspur Crossing, with a translated letter in her coat pocket explaining what she had not had the courage to write plainly. And she watched something in the old man's spine give way the moment he understood the particular collapse of a father who has outlived his child by an ocean's width of denial. He did not blame her. That surprised her more than his grief did. He knelt at June's grave the evening he arrived and stayed there long after dark, speaking to the mound of earth in a dialect Isolde barely remembered from her own grandmother. And when he finally rose, he told her, in words she would carry the rest of her life, that a daughter who buries a husband alone in a country that hates her has already proven herself more than any son could have. He stayed. He worked the fields beside her, despite hands too stiff for the labor, and a heart the Larkspur doctor would later diagnose, dismissively and without examination, as simply old. He taught her things June had never had time to, how to read weather in the color of the western sky, how to splint a fence post so it would hold through a real prairie storm, how to barter with the quieter, kinder ranchers on the far side of the creek who judged a person by the strength of their handshake rather than the shape of their eyes. Together, they built a second room onto the soddy, a small, stubborn act of permanence that made the whole claim feel, for the first time since June's death, like it might actually belong to someone who intended to stay. The town tolerated him marginally better than they tolerated her, the particular grudging respect reserved for old men who ask nothing and complain less, But even that thin goodwill soured whenever Bertram Hollis's name came up over the trading post counter, because everyone in Larkspur Crossing understood, whether or not they said it aloud, that Hollis had his eye on the creek water running through the Beck claim, and that an old man and a foreign widow made for an easier negotiation than most. The blizzard that took Hyunwoo Beck arrived without the courtesy of warning that the plains usually offered, a sky gone the color of a bruise in the space of an hour while he was out chasing 3 head of cattle that had wandered through a gap in a fence Hollis's men had been seen near only days before, a detail Isul would turn over in her mind for years afterward without ever being able to prove what she suspected. She went looking for him when the storm had thinned enough to see past her own hand, and found him a quarter mile from the house, sitting upright against a fence post, with snow already drifted against his shoulder. His heart simply stopped, the doctor said later, from cold and age and exertion that a younger man might have survived, and he had not. She dragged him home alone through drifts that came to her waist, refusing to leave him for the wolves that had been calling all night from the creek bottom, and she dug his grave beside his son's in ground that fought her every inch of the way, because the earth in that country, she had learned, never gave up anything without extracting a price first. Larkspur Crossing sent no committee this time. There was no pretense of concern left to perform for a widow who had now buried 2 Becks in 2 winters, and clearly, in the town's quiet consensus, brought some manner of ill luck with her from wherever she had come from. What the town sent instead, within the week, was Bertram Hollis himself, dressed for sympathy in a black coat too fine for a condolence call, offering to buy the claim outright at a price so far beneath its worth that the insult was itself a kind of message, and remarking as he studied the creek that ran along her northern fence line, that a woman alone with no man to defend a title rarely held on to good land for long in this territory, one way or another. Isolde recognized the phrase instantly, the same one the church women had used 2 winters before, and understood in that moment that Hollis had likely been the source of it all along, patient as a man who had learned that grief, left alone long enough, does most of the work of taking land that force alone might not get away with. She refused him with the same flat civility she had used on the church women, and watched him leave with the particular calm of a man merely revising his timeline, not his plan. By midsummer of the 3rd year, Hollis's patience had visibly begun to fray, and the small cruelties that followed his refused offer arrived with a rhythm too consistent to be accident. A fence cut clean in the night and left open for her cattle to wander toward a ravine that would have killed half the herd if she had not found the gap by lantern light before dawn. A wagon wheel found split clean through on the one morning a year she needed it whole to haul grain to market before the price dropped, a well that ran suddenly cloudy for 3 days that summer, in a way the local rancher's wife who came to check on her, quietly against her husband's wishes, said she had never seen a well do naturally in 20 years on that creek. Isolde said nothing to the sheriff because she had already learned in her first winter alone exactly how much protection the law extended to a woman the town had decided did not fully belong to it. She said nothing to Hollis either, because giving him the satisfaction of her fear was its own kind of surrender. And she had made her promise on June's grave 2 winters before, never to hand this land another inch of ground it had not already earned through weather and grief alone. Instead, she began sleeping with a loaded shotgun within reach of the bed, a habit that would have horrified the version of herself who had stepped off that wagon 3 years earlier, speaking almost no English and trusting almost everyone. And she began quietly, learning to use it properly, practicing on bottles lined along the creek bank until her aim stopped embarrassing her. The rancher's wife, who had warned her about the well, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, who lived close enough to see smoke from Isolde's chimney, but far enough to visit only when her husband was away, became the closest thing Isolde had to an ally inside the town's borders, though even Clara admitted, apologetically, that there was little she could do beyond warnings passed in whispers over a fence line. Isolde understood the shape of the trap, closing around her clearly enough by then, that Hollis wanted the creek water badly enough to squeeze her out slowly, rather than risk the scandal of moving against her outright. And every small sabotage was a test of exactly how much pressure it would take before a woman with 2 graves behind her house finally broke and sold. She resolved, watching Clara's wagon disappear down the road that evening, that he would learn precisely how much pressure that actually was, and that the answer would take longer to arrive at than he currently believed. The humiliation that finally drove the town's cruelty into the open came on a market day in late August, when Isolde arrived at the trading post with a wagon of sorghum and dried beans grown, harvested, and hauled entirely by her own hands, only to be told by the store's owner, a heavy-set man named Purnell, who had done business with Jun without complaint for 2 full seasons, that he could no longer extend credit against future crops to a claim with no man's name legally attached to it, regardless of how many years she had farmed it or how reliably she had paid every debt before. She asked, in English she no longer needed to practice in a mirror, whether the debt itself had ever been the problem, and Purnell would not meet her eyes to answer. A small crowd had gathered by then, drawn by the particular gravity of public discomfort, and among them stood 2 of the churchwomen who had once told her, so gently, to sell and go east, watching now, with expressions that were not quite satisfaction, but were not quite sympathy either. The sheriff, present and idle by the feed store, made no move to intervene when one of Hollis's hired men suggested loudly enough for the whole street to hear that a claim run by a foreign widow with no protector was exactly the kind of situation that invited trouble. And that trouble, once invited, tended to arrive whether a body wanted it to or not. Isolde loaded her unsold sorghum back onto the wagon in a silence so complete that even the crowd seemed to feel the weight of it. And she drove the 11 miles home alone in the fading light, with her jaw set and her hands steady on the reins, despite everything inside her that wanted to shake. She did not cry that night either. She had learned, 3 winters into this life, that tears were a currency she could no longer afford to spend on an audience that would only read them as proof of her weakness rather than the cost of her endurance. Instead, she sat on June's grave in the last of the summer light, between the 2 markers now standing crooked in ground that had never once been generous to her. And she told her husband, in her own language, that she intended to survive this too, whatever it cost, because leaving now would mean that everything both graves had already paid for had bought her nothing at all. Odessa Freeman had homesteaded the claim 2 ridgelines east of Isolde's for 6 years by the time the 2 women finally spoke as more than distant neighbors. A formerly enslaved woman from Kentucky who had walked most of the way west with a freedom paper folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and who understood, better than almost anyone else in the county, exactly what it cost to hold land that a place like Larkspur Crossing believed you had no right to keep. They met properly the autumn after the trading post humiliation, when Odessa rode over unannounced with a jar of salve and a blunt assessment of the burn scarring Isolde's forearm from an accident with the stove, and stayed to treat it herself, with a competence that made clear she had done this kind of doctoring far more often than the town's paid physician ever had reason to. Odessa asked no questions about Isolde's homeland or her husband's death that Isolde did not offer freely, and in exchange Isolde asked nothing about the scars on Odessa's own back that peeked above her collar when she reached for the salve jar, an unspoken agreement between 2 women who had each learned the hard way that some histories are shared only when the person carrying them chooses to set the weight down. What grew between them over the following months was not friendship in the easy sense the word usually carried in town, all shared suppers and church committees, but something sturdier, forged in the practical currency of survival. Odessa's knowledge of herbs that grew wild on the plains and healed things the doctor in town charged too much to treat. Traded for Isol's steady hands during a difficult calving that saved both cow and calf on a night, Odessa's own arthritis made the work impossible alone. They rode the 11 miles between their claims often enough that the path wore a visible line through the grass, a route the two of them referred to, in the dry private humor that had grown between them, as the only road in the county that had never once turned them away. Larkspur Crossing noticed the friendship with the particular disapproval it reserved for anything that suggested its outsiders might not need the town's approval to survive. And the disapproval sharpened into something closer to alarm once it became clear that two women the town had each tried, separately to starve out through neglect and cruelty, had instead found in each other exactly the reinforcement neither one had needed the town to provide. There was a particular evening in late autumn that Isol would return to often in the years that followed, long after everything that came next had reshaped how she understood it. When she and Odessa sat on the low porch step of the soddy shelling, the last of the season's beans into a shared bowl between them, the sky over the plains doing the slow gold to violet thing it only seemed to do in that country, and Odessa, unprompted, began humming something low and wordless that Isol recognized after a moment as a hymn, though not one sung the way Larkspur Crossing's church sang it, slower, rounder, carrying a grief inside its melody that the town's version had scrubbed clean away. Isol found herself humming something back without deciding to, a lullaby her mother had sung across an ocean and a lifetime she rarely let herself think about directly. And for a few minutes, the two of them sat trading fragments of two entirely different griefs in two entirely different languages, understanding each other perfectly without translating a single word. It was, Isol thought later, one of the only truly peaceful hours she had known since stepping off that wagon 3 years before, a small pocket of warmth stolen from a country that had offered her almost none of its own accord. The peace did not last past dusk. As the light finally failed, Odessa's gaze sharpened toward the eastern ridge, and Isol followed it to find 3 riders sitting motionless on the horizon, watching the 2 homesteads with the patient, unhurried stillness of men who had nowhere else they needed to be, men Odessa identified without hesitation by the cut of their coats and the particular arrogance of how they sat a horse, as belonging to Bertram Hollis. Neither woman said anything for a long moment, the bowl of beans forgotten between them, and then Odessa stood, brushed the dust from her skirt with a steadiness that did not match the tightness suddenly visible around her mouth, and said quietly that she intended to ride the long way home tonight, past the Hollis line, just to make certain the men watching them had somewhere better to be watch doing than sitting on a ridge after dark. Isol asked her not to. Odessa went anyway, the way she always did when she had decided a thing needed doing, and Isol stood on the porch until the sound of hooves had faded entirely into the dark, carrying an unease she could not yet name, but would come to recognize with terrible clarity before the week was through. Whoa! The fire came 3 nights later, close to midnight, catching first in the dry hay stacked along the north edge of Isol's barn, in a manner the volunteer fire company from Larkspur Crossing would later rule. With visible reluctance, as probably not accidental, though probably was as far as anyone in an official position was willing to commit on paper. Isol woke to the smell before the sound, smoke already thick enough to sting her eyes by the time she reached the yard, and she spent the better part of an hour hauling water from the well with a bucket that felt lighter each trip, only because her arms had gone past feeling the weight of anything at all, working alone against a fire that would have taken the whole barn and likely the house behind it, if the autumn air had not been damp enough to slow the spread. She did not know, in the chaos of it, that Odessa had seen the glow of the flames from her own ridge 2 miles east and had ridden straight for it in the dark without stopping to saddle properly, cutting across broken ground. She knew too well to normally risk at night, until her horse caught a foot in a prairie dog hole hidden beneath frost-stiffened grass and went down hard, throwing her clear but not clean, her head striking a half-buried stone with a force that stunned her into the kind of stillness that, out on the empty plains in October cold, kills as surely as any fire does. A rancher's hand found her at first light, unconscious and half-frozen in the grass a mile short of Isol's burning barn, and carried her the rest of the way himself, once he understood whose claim she had nearly died trying to reach. Isul, exhausted and smoke-blackened from a fire she had fought alone and mostly won, found Odessa laid across her own kitchen table instead, breathing shallow and uneven, a wound along her temple that the town doctor, arriving hours late and visibly annoyed at having been summoned for a black woman's injury on a foreign widow's claim, dressed with a briskness that made painfully clear how little urgency he intended to bring to the case. Isul sat beside her through what remained of that night and every night that followed, doing everything Odessa herself had once taught her about fever and wound care, refusing to accept what the slow worsening of Odessa's breathing over the following days was already trying to tell her. Odessa Freeman died on the 5th day, in the same house where she had once treated Isul's burned arm with a gentleness the town's own doctor had never managed once, and Isul dug the 3rd grave herself in ground gone hard again with the season's first true frost, working through the night because grief, she had learned twice already, moved faster and hit harder when a body had nothing to occupy its hands. Larkspur Crossing's response to the news, when it finally traveled the 11 miles into town, was not grief but a kind of grim vindication that turned Isul's stomach even through the fog of her own mourning, a murmur that grew louder by the week, that the Bayek widow's claim seemed cursed in some fashion. Nobody cared to define precisely. That 3 graves in 3 years behind one house was the sort of thing decent, God-fearing people ought to take seriously as a warning rather than a tragedy, that perhaps the kindest thing left to do, for everyone's sake including her own, was to finally accept Hollis's standing offer and let the land go to someone the country actually wanted to keep. A petition began circulating quietly among a handful of the more fervent church families, worded carefully enough to avoid outright accusation, suggesting the claim be reviewed for reasons of public welfare. And though it never gathered enough support to force any legal action, the mere existence of it told Isul everything she needed to know about how thin the ground beneath her had actually become. She stood at Odessa's grave the evening the petition talk reached her, 3 crooked markers now standing in a row behind the house. She had built a life around against every possible discouragement, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after so long spent fighting to avoid it, that Larkspur Crossing would never see her as anything but a temporary inconvenience, no matter how many winters she survived or how many graves she dug with her own bleeding hands. But understanding that changed nothing about her resolve, only sharpened it into something colder and harder than the grief that had briefly threatened to bury her alongside the people she had loved and lost. She made a 4th promise that night, standing over Odessa's fresh grave with frost already forming on the disturbed earth, that whatever the coming winter brought, however many more losses this country demanded as the price of her staying, she would not give Bertram Hollis the satisfaction of a 4th grave that was her own, and she would not leave this land to men who had never once earned the right to take it from her. What she could not yet know was what, or who, that 4th winter actually intended to bring her instead. The 4th winter arrived early and mean, the first hard freeze settling over the plains a full 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and Isul had just finished banking the fire for the night when she heard something that was not the wind scraping against the north wall of the house, a low, dragging sound that stopped and started and stopped again, too rhythmic to be a branch, too weak to be a threat. She needed the shotgun for, though she brought it anyway when she opened the door into the dark. What she found collapsed against her fence post was a man she had never seen in Larkspur Crossing or anywhere else in the county. His coat soaked through with blood, gone black in the cold along his left side, his face pale enough beneath several days of beard that she took him, for one frozen heartbeat, for already dead. He was not. His eyes opened when her lantern light crossed his face, and what she saw in them was not the fear or confusion she might have expected from a dying stranger, but something closer to calculation. A man taking rapid stock of exactly how much danger the person standing over him represented, before whatever strength that calculation cost him gave out entirely, and his eyes rolled closed again. She should have left him. Every practical instinct sharpened by 4 years of a hostile country told her that a wounded stranger, likely fleeing something, or someone dangerous enough to have shot him, was exactly the sort of complication a woman already balanced on the thin edge of survival could not afford to invite across her threshold. She dragged him inside anyway, half carrying his weight across ground, already treacherous with ice, because the alternative, leaving a dying man in her yard through a night this cold, whatever his sins, was a cruelty she found she could not perform even against a stranger who had given her every reason for suspicion and none yet for trust. She cleaned the wound by lamplight with hands that had learned this exact grim competence from Odessa, a bullet track along his ribs that had missed anything vital by a margin narrow enough to be either luck or something closer to a miracle. And she worked through the night, packing it with what herbs she had dried through autumn, listening to his breathing, steady from ragged to merely labored, and she did not once ask him his name, because some part of her, honed sharp by 3 years of loss, already suspected that whatever answer he eventually gave her would change everything that came after it. He told her his name was Judah Colton on the second day, offered without her having to ask, in a voice roughened by blood loss and disuse that nonetheless carried a careful, deliberate quality, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words chosen wrong could cost more than silence ever did. He did not tell her, that day or for many days after, who had put a bullet through his side, or why 3 riders had apparently tracked him halfway across the territory before losing his trail in the first hard snow of the season. And Isul did not press him, partly because she had learned the wisdom of not asking questions whose answers might obligate her to act on them, and partly because something in the careful way he watched her move through her own house, tracking the graves visible through the frosted window with an attention that seemed to carry weight beyond simple curiosity, told her the silence between them was not entirely his to fill alone. She hid him in the small root cellar dug beneath the addition Hyunwoo had built 2 winters before, a space warm enough to keep a wounded man alive and hidden enough to keep him unseen by anyone who might come asking. And she brought him broth and clean water on a schedule that quickly became its own kind of quiet routine, the 2 of them speaking less than either seemed to want to, and more than either had probably intended. It was on the 4th night, when fever loosened his guard enough to let something slip past the careful architecture of his silence, that he said a name in his sleep that made Isolde go still over the bowl of broth she had been spooning between his cracked lips. Jun's name, spoken not as a stranger might stumble across an unfamiliar syllable, but as a man remembering someone he had actually known, said with a grief in it that had no business belonging to a wounded drifter who claimed never to have set foot in this county before. She did not wake him to ask. She sat instead in the dim cellar, like turning the moment over with the same careful suspicion she turned over everything this land had ever handed her. And by morning, she had convinced herself she had misheard a fevered mumble for a name that grief had simply taught her to hear everywhere, in every wind and every stranger's mouth. She would spend the following weeks wishing, with a bitterness that surprised her, that she had trusted that first instinct instead of talking herself out of it. Judah healed faster than the doctor Isolde never called would have predicted. The particular resilience of a man whose body had clearly done this kind of recovering before, and by the time the first real blizzard of the season closed the roads for the better part of a week, he had graduated from the cellar to the addition's spare cot, and from silence to a low, economical kind of conversation that revealed almost nothing about his past, while somehow, gradually, revealing quite a lot about the man underneath it. He mended fence without being asked. He rebuilt the section of the barn the fire had weakened, working through cold that would have driven most hired men indoors by noon. And he did it, Isolde noticed, with the particular grim thoroughness of someone paying down a debt he had not stated aloud, rather than performing gratitude for shelter given. Word of the stranger at the Bayek claim reached Larkspur Crossing within days of the road's clearing, as word of everything eventually did, and the first sign of what that word would cost her arrived on a gray afternoon in the shape of 2 of Hollis's men riding up her lane with the loose, unhurried confidence of men who had never once been made to answer for anything they had done on this land before. They asked about the stranger with a directness that barely bothered disguising itself as concern for her welfare, and Isolde was midway through a careful, deliberately unhelpful answer when Judah stepped out of the barn behind her, no coat despite the cold, his stance loose in a way that read, to anyone who had ever seen a dangerous man stand still, as anything but relaxed. He said nothing threatening. He did not need to. The 2 riders took a long, measuring look at him, the kind of look men give when they are recalculating odds they had assumed were settled and left with considerably less swagger than they had arrived with, promising in the vague way men like that always promise things that Mr. Hollis would want to hear about this personally. Isul turned to Judah once the riders were out of earshot and asked him, plainly, whether his presence had just made her situation better or considerably worse. And he answered, after a pause long enough to suggest he was weighing the honest response against a gentler one, that he intended to make certain it was the former, whatever it cost him to guarantee it. It was the first promise he had made her since arriving at her fence line bleeding, and she found, against every hard-won instinct that told her not to, that she believed him. The confrontation the whole territory would eventually hear about happened on a market morning in early January, when Isul rode into Larkspur Crossing for supplies she could no longer put off buying, and found Hollis himself waiting near the trading post, with 6 men arranged behind him in a loose, deliberate line, the kind of number assembled specifically to be seen, rather than strictly needed. He informed her, in front of a street that had gone conspicuously quiet, that harboring an unknown and likely dangerous fugitive on her claim constituted more than sufficient grounds for the county to finally, formally, review whether a woman in her position ought to be permitted to hold contested land at all, and that it would go considerably easier for her, he suggested, if she simply signed the papers he happened to have brought along and let this unfortunate business end quietly. Isul had opened her mouth to answer him, with whatever careful, insufficient words she could manage, when Judah's voice came from behind her, calm and carrying, the voice of a man who had clearly done this exact kind of arithmetic before and already knew how it would end. He crossed the street to stand beside her, his coat open despite the cold, in a way that made the gun at his hip impossible to miss, and told Hollis, loud enough for the whole gathered street to hear it clearly, that she was not his to move, that whatever business Hollis believed he had with the Beck claim would now go through him first, and that 6 men standing in a row in the middle of a public street looked a great deal less like law, and considerably more like exactly the kind of trouble a territory judge tended to take a personal interest in. Hollis, who had built his considerable local power on being the most dangerous man in most rooms he entered, found himself, for possibly the first time in years, standing across from someone the street recognized, by reputation alone, as more dangerous still, and the recalculation crossed his face plainly before he managed to smooth it back into something like composure. He left without the papers signed. The crowd that had gathered to watch a widow finally forced off her claim watched instead, in a silence that would take days to properly digest into gossip. A gunslinger, with a reputation half the territory had heard, whispered in fearful tones, choose publicly and unmistakably to stand on the side of the Korean widow the town had spent 3 years trying to starve out. Isul rode home that afternoon beside a man she still knew almost nothing true about and understood, watching the set of his jaw in the winter light, that whatever debt or reason had first brought him bleeding to her fence line had somewhere along the way become something considerably harder to name. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them named aloud, but both seemed to understand. Mornings spent working the frozen half of the claim side by side, evenings spent in a quiet that had stopped feeling like the careful silence of 2 strangers and started feeling like something closer to companionship. The kind built less on words exchanged than on the accumulated weight of small, chosen gestures. The extra blanket he left, folded outside her door, on the coldest nights without ever mentioning it. The way she had begun setting his coffee before he asked for it. The 2 of them falling without discussion into a division of labor that assumed, without either one saying so, that he intended to stay through spring. It was on an evening in late January, the 2 of them mending harness by the stove while wind tested the walls outside, that Isul finally asked him the question she had been circling for weeks, the one his sleeping mouth had first raised, and her waking caution had spent equally long trying to bury, how he had come to know her husband's name. Judah did not answer immediately. He set down the harness in his hands with the particular care of a man buying himself time. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the guarded economy she had grown used to, replaced by something raw, something that had clearly been waiting a long time for permission to be said aloud. He told her he had ridden as a hired guard on the wagon train that had first carried word of available brides west 3 years before her own crossing, though not her train, an earlier one, and that on that crossing he had known a Korean laborer named Jun, who had signed on to work passage in exchange for eventual land. A quiet, hard-working man who had talked, on the long nights around the fire, about a photograph he carried of a woman he had not yet married, and a farm he intended to build good enough to bring her to. Isol's hands went still on the harness in her lap. Judah kept talking, quieter now, the words coming out with the particular difficulty of things carried too long and finally set down. He told her that during a raid on that earlier crossing, a moment of chaos and gunfire he had spent 3 years turning over in his mind, trying to find the version where he had done something differently, June had taken a wound meant for him, had pushed him clear of a shot Judah should have seen coming, and had not. A wound that healed enough to let June keep traveling, keep working, keep building the very farm he had described around the fire, but never healed clean, never stopped weakening something underneath the skin that a plains fever, 3 years later, finally found and finished. Isol sat with that for a long moment before she found words for any of it, the fire cracking in the stove between them, while outside the wind kept working at the walls exactly as it had every night since she arrived in this country, indifferent to whatever was breaking or mending inside the house it surrounded. She asked him, finally, why he had never simply told her this the moment he had first said his name, and Judah's answer, when it came, carried none of the deflection she had half expected, and all of the exhausted honesty of a man who had clearly rehearsed this confession many times without ever intending to deliver it under these particular circumstances. He told her he had spent 3 years drifting through gun work he took no pride in, chasing a restlessness he eventually admitted to himself was really just guilt wearing a more acceptable name, until a chance conversation in a trading post 2 counties over had mentioned in passing a Korean widow holding a claim near Larkspur Crossing against considerable local pressure, and something in him had recognized, before his conscious mind had caught up to the recognition, exactly whose widow that must be. He had not come to her fence line by accident that first bleeding night. Not entirely. He had been riding toward this exact claim for 11 days already, wounded not by the men chasing him from an unrelated piece of trouble 2 counties back, but arriving at her door regardless, because some part of him had decided, long before he had worked out what he actually intended to say to her, that he owed the woman June had died, protecting a debt he had no idea how to repay, and had come anyway, hoping the answer might arrive once he was standing in front of her. Isol felt something complicated move through her at that. Grief for a husband whose death she now understood differently than she had for 3 years. And beneath the grief, something that resembled anger at a man who had let her nurse him for weeks without this truth between them. And beneath even that, quieter and more unwelcome than either, something that looked uncomfortably like gratitude that he had come at all, that whatever guilt had driven him here had also, somewhere in the driving, become something that no longer had guilt as its only engine. She did not answer him that night. She sat instead in the firelit quiet, turning 3 winters and 3 graves and 1 impossible coincidence over in her mind, while Judah waited, still and silent, for whatever verdict she eventually chose to hand down. Understanding, better than most men would have, that some debts could not be settled with an apology alone, no matter how honestly it was finally offered. She gave him no answer for 3 days, days spent working the claim, in a silence that had turned heavier than any silence they had shared before, and Judah, to his credit, did not press her for one, did not follow her into the fields to argue his case or crowd the grief he had clearly understood. He had earned the right to cause, but not the right to rush. It was at June's grave, on the 4th morning, that Isil finally found something like clarity, kneeling in snow beside the marker she had carved herself with a knife 3 winters before. And she understood, turning Judah's confession over one final time against everything else this land had already demanded of her, that anger and gratitude were not, in fact, opposites requiring a choice between them, that a person could hold both at once the same way the plains held both brutal winter and eventual spring, without ever fully choosing which one it actually was. She found Judah in the barn that afternoon, and she told him, in words considerably steadier than she felt saying them, that she did not forgive him for the silence, not yet, but that she understood the weight he had carried alone for 3 years, because she had carried her own version of that weight through 3 winters of her own, and that a man who rode 11 days wounded toward a debt he could have simply outrun instead was not, whatever else he might be, a man who deserved to keep carrying it entirely alone. Something eased in his face at that, not relief exactly, something quieter and more permanent. And it was that evening, mending fence in the last gray light before the season's harshest cold finally began, unmistakably, to loosen its grip, that he took her hand for the first time without either of them treating it as an accident, and neither one pulled away. The weeks that followed brought the earliest signs of thaw the plains had offered in 4 years of watching her survive their worst. Ice softening along the creek, the first stubborn green pushing up through snow, still lingering in the shadow of the barn and Larkspur Crossing. Whatever it had expected from the winter it had spent, certain would finally break the Bayek widow, began instead to hear a very different story traveling its streets, that the gunslinger and the widow had been seen working the claim together at dawn, laughing over something no one close enough to overhear, that whatever debt or danger had first brought him to her door had settled unmistakably into something the whole territory was starting to call by its actual name. If you have stayed with Iseul this long, you already know this was never really a story about winter. By the time full spring arrived, the fourth one Iseul Bayek had faced on that homestead, and the first she had not faced entirely alone, Bertram Hollis's grip on Larkspur Crossing had loosened considerably. His sabotage exposed once 2 of his own hired men, no longer willing to work for a boss now publicly humbled by a gunslinger's reputation, confirmed to a visiting territory, marshal exactly whose orders had cut those fences and poisoned that well, and very likely set that barn alight 3 autumns before. Testimony that cost Hollis both his standing and, eventually, his creekside ambitions altogether. The church that had once moved her to the back pew found its congregation considerably more welcoming once word spread of who exactly sat beside her there now. Though Iseul noted with a dry amusement she allowed herself only around Judah, that the town's newfound warmth had less to do with any genuine change of heart and everything to do with which side of a gunfight it preferred to stand on. She did not need their welcome by then. She had built something on that land across 4 brutal winters that no single season of belated kindness could undo or replace. 3 graves standing in a row behind a house that had finally, this spring, gained a 4th marker of an entirely different kind. Not a grave, but a fence post, carved with the date she and Judah had stood before the circuit preacher and made their arrangement formal in the eyes of a law that had never once protected her, but would, at least now, recognize her claim as fully, unquestionably her own, shared by choice rather than circumstance, with a man who had ridden 11 days wounded to find her. If you have made it this far through Iseul and Judah's 4 winters, I want to ask you honestly in the comments below, which of the 5 beats of this story hit you the hardest? The grave she dug alone in frozen ground, the morning he stood between her and 6 armed men, or the confession that finally explained why he had come? Tell me down there which moment stayed with you longest. And if this kind of slow-burn frontier story is one you want more of, subscribe and stay. Because there are more women like Iseul waiting to be told, more winters survived alone that deserved, eventually, someone willing to stay through all 4.